November 11th, 1918, the crosshairs settled perfectly on the American officer's temple. But Private Friedrich Muller's finger froze on the trigger through the scope of his Guhar 98 rifle. Positioned in the shattered remnants of a French farmhouse near the Argonne forest, he watched something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The morning mist clung to the battlefield like a shroud, carrying with it the acrid smell of cordite and death. Müller had been a sniper for the German Imperial Army for 3 years, with 47 confirmed kills etched into his consciousness like scars on his soul. Each kill had been justified by war, by duty, by the simple mathematics of survival. But on this particular morning, as the world teetered on the edge of armistice, he witnessed something that transcended the brutal calculus of combat. The American officer, later identified as Captain James Anderson of the 77th Division, stood approximately 300 meters away in a shell crater. Muller's position was impeccably elevated, concealed, with perfect lighting conditions. The wind was minimal, perhaps 5 kilometers per hour from the northwest. Everything about the shot was textbook perfect. Müller had made far more difficult shots under worse conditions. This should have been routine, another entry in the grim ledger of war. His orders were clear. Eliminate enemy officers to disrupt American command structure during these final, desperate hours of combat. But Captain Anderson wasn't issuing orders. He wasn't coordinating an attack or studying maps. Instead, he had removed his helmet and was kneeling beside a wounded German soldier. One of Muller's own countrymen, offering the dying man water from his own canteen. Müller watched through his scope as Anderson cradled the German soldier's head, speaking to him softly, though Müller could hear nothing at this distance. The American officer's uniform was caked with mud, his face etched with exhaustion that spoke of months in the trenches. But his movements were gentle, deliberate, as he tried to make the German soldier's final moments more bearable. Müller's training screamed at him to take the shot. His finger rested against the trigger, requiring only 2 kilograms of pressure to send a 7.92 millimeter round through the American skull. The war had taught him to see enemy soldiers not as human beings but as targets, threats to be eliminated. 3 years of industrialized slaughter had numbed him to death, or so he had believed. He had watched friends torn apart by artillery, gassed in trenches, machine-gunned crossing no man's land. He had killed British soldiers at Ypres, French soldiers at Verdun, and now Americans in the Argonne. Each death was supposed to bring Germany closer to victory, though as the war dragged into its 5th year, victory seemed an increasingly hollow concept. According to accounts later documented in the United States Army Historical Division archives, this incident occurred during the final hours before the armistice took effect at 11 o'clock that morning. The Meuse-Argonne offensive had been the deadliest battle in American military history, claiming over 26,000 American lives and leaving nearly 96,000 wounded. The German army, exhausted and depleted, was collapsing along the Western Front. Both sides knew the end was imminent, yet men continued to die for yards of mud that would soon be meaningless. Muller's hands began to tremble slightly, not from cold or fear, but from something else entirely, a crack in the armor of indifference that had protected his humanity throughout this nightmare. Muller's mind drifted back involuntarily to August 4th, 1914, when he had enlisted with the fervor of youth and patriotic delusion. He had been 20 years old, a university student studying philosophy in Munich, convinced like millions of others that the war would be a glorious adventure, over by Christmas. His father, a veteran of the Franco-Prussian War, had tried to warn him about the reality of combat. But Friedrich had dismissed the old man's concerns as the pessimism of a different generation. Modern warfare, Friedrich had believed, would be clean, decisive, heroic. For years and 3 months later, those beliefs seemed to belong to someone else entirely, a naive boy who had died somewhere in the trenches even though his body kept functioning. He had first killed a man on September 23, 1914. During the First Battle of the Aisne, a French soldier, young like himself, had emerged from a trench only 50 meters away. Müller had fired without thinking, and the man had dropped like a puppet with severed strings. That night, Müller had vomited until his stomach was empty, then wept until he had no more tears. His sergeant, a grizzled veteran named Klaus Zimmermann, had found him shaking behind a destroyed barn. "It gets easier," Zimmermann had said, offering him schnapps from a flask. "You learn not to think about it." Zimmermann had been right, in the worst possible way. The killing had become easier. The conscience that had tormented him after that first kill had gradually grown quiet, buried under the daily brutality of trench warfare. Mueller had discovered he possessed a particular talent, an exceptional eye for distance and wind, steady hands, infinite patience, and the ability to control his breathing and heartbeat. These gifts had transformed him into one of the most effective snipers in his regiment. His superiors had noticed, and by spring 1915, he had been assigned to specialized sniper training. The German army had pioneered modern sniper tactics, recognizing that a skilled marksman could create disproportionate impact on enemy morale and operations. Mueller had excelled in training, learning to read terrain, to construct hides, to calculate for distance and wind, and even the Coriolis effect on extremely long shots. He had been issued the finest equipment, a Guhor 98 with a custom Zeiss telescopic sight, capable of accuracy at ranges exceeding 600 meters. He had become a ghost on the battlefield, an invisible dealer of death. But somewhere in the accumulation of kills, in the endless parade of men falling in his crosshairs, something inside Mueller had begun to break. The protective numbness he had cultivated had started developing cracks. He found himself wondering about the men he killed, their names, their families, their dreams that would never be realized. He had started having nightmares, vivid dreams where all 47 of his victims stood in a line, staring at him with accusatory eyes. He would wake, gasping, drenched in sweat, the faces still haunting him in the darkness. 3 months earlier, in August 1918, Mueller had killed a British officer near Amiens during Germany's desperate defensive battles. Through his scope, he had watched the man reading a letter, smiling at whatever news it contained. Mueller had shot him through the heart. Later, during a patrol, Mueller had recovered the letter from the dead officer's body, driven by a compulsion he didn't understand. It was from the man's daughter, age 7, describing a drawing she had made of her father. The letter ended with, "Come home soon, Daddy. I miss you terribly." Mueller had carried that letter in his pocket ever since, a small penance for sins too numerous to count. Now, watching Captain Anderson comfort a dying German soldier, Mueller felt those carefully constructed walls completely crumble. This American officer, this enemy, was demonstrating more humanity in this single moment than Mueller had shown in 3 years of war. Through his scope, Mueller could see the German soldier Anderson was helping wear the insignia of the 52nd Infantry Division. The man was clearly dying, even at 300 meters. Mueller could recognize the gray pallor of death, the way his body had gone slack, except for occasional spasms of pain. From the amount of blood soaking the man's uniform, Mueller guessed he had taken shrapnel to the abdomen, probably from the American artillery barrage that had pounded their positions at dawn. Such wounds were inevitably fatal, especially this far from any field hospital. The man had hours, at most, more likely minutes. Mueller knew the 52nd Division had been rushed to this sector just 10 days earlier, pulled from reserve positions near Sedan. They were composed largely of young recruits, boys barely 18 years old, and older men in their 40s who had been previously exempt from service. Germany was scraping the bottom of its manpower barrel, throwing undertrained and under-equipped soldiers into the meat grinder of a war already lost. This dying soldier was likely one of those boys, perhaps on the front lines for less than 2 weeks before catching the shrapnel that was now killing him. Captain Anderson had removed his own field jacket and was using it to pillow the German soldier's head. The American officer's lips were moving continuously, and though Mueller couldn't hear the words, he recognized the rhythm of prayer. Anderson was praying for an enemy soldier, speaking words of comfort to a man whose army had been trying to kill him for months. The captain pulled something from his pocket. It looked like a small book, probably a Bible, and appeared to be reading from it. The German soldier's hand reached up weakly, grasping Anderson's sleeve, and the American officer took that hand in his own, holding it gently. Mueller's finger slipped off the trigger entirely. He continued watching, unable to look away, unable to take the shot that every tenet of his training demanded. His mind raced with justifications for not firing. The armistice was scheduled to begin in less than 3 hours. What was the point of one more death when the war was effectively over? But he knew these were rationalizations. The truth was simpler and more profound. He could not kill a man engaged in such an act of mercy. The scene before him contradicted everything the war had taught him about the enemy. German propaganda had spent 4 years dehumanizing the Allies, portraying them as barbaric Hun haters bent on Germany's destruction. The Americans were supposed to be naive cowboys playing at war, lacking the discipline and culture of European armies. British and French soldiers were depicted as colonial oppressors who deserved their fate. But this American officer, this supposed enemy, was demonstrating a humanity that transcended national boundaries and military allegiances. Müller thought about the dying German soldier's perspective. The man probably knew he was dying, knew he would never see home again, never see whatever family awaited him in Germany. But in his final moments, he wasn't alone. An enemy was treating him with dignity, offering comfort and companionship in death. That had to count for something. That had to mean something in the cosmic ledger of this senseless war. Time seemed to stretch as Müller watched. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. Anderson never left the dying soldier's side, never showed impatience or discomfort despite being exposed in no man's land, where any German sniper like Müller himself could kill him. The American officer's courage wasn't the reckless bravery of a charge or the desperate valor of last stands. It was something quieter but perhaps more profound, the courage to remain human in the midst of mechanized slaughter, to risk death not for victory but for simple compassion. Müller realized he was crying, tears blurring his vision through the rifle scope. When had he started weeping? He couldn't remember. The tears felt strange, alien. He hadn't cried since those first terrible months of war. He had thought himself incapable of tears anymore. All emotion burned away by 3 years of horror. Captain James Anderson, of Portland, Maine, had enlisted in the United States Army on April 6, 1917, the very day America declared war on Germany. He had been 28 years old, schoolteacher with a wife named Margaret and a 5-year-old daughter named Sarah. He could have avoided service teachers, were considered essential for the home front, and he had dependents. But Anderson had felt compelled by duty and idealism, believing America's entry into the war would tip the balance and end the slaughter that had consumed Europe for nearly 3 years. His training at Camp Devens in Massachusetts had been rushed and inadequate, as was typical for the rapidly expanding American expeditionary forces. The United States Army had grown from a peacetime force of 130,000 men to over 4 million in just 18 months. Anderson had shown natural leadership abilities and had been commissioned as a second lieutenant after 3 months of officer training. He had shipped out to France in February 1918, arriving at Saint-Nazaire with the 77th Division, a unit composed largely of draftees from New York City. His first exposure to combat had come during the Aisne-Marne offensive in July, and the reality of modern warfare had shattered his idealistic notions within hours. Anderson had watched men he had trained with, men he had shared meals and stories with, torn apart by machine gun fire and artillery. He had seen soldiers drowned in mud, suffocated by gas, burned by flamethrowers. The industrial efficiency of killing had appalled him. But he had adapted because adaptation was the only alternative to death or madness. By October 1918, Anderson had been promoted to captain and assigned to lead Company C of the 307th Infantry Regiment. His company had been thrown into the Meuse-Argonne offensive, the massive American-led assault that would ultimately break German resistance, but at a horrific cost. Anderson's company had fought through the Argonne Forest's nightmare landscape of barbed wire, machine gun nests, and artillery barrages. He had started the offensive with 142 men. By November 10th, only 73 remained alive and unwounded. The previous night, November 10th, 1918, Anderson had received word through command channels that an armistice would take effect at 11 o'clock the following morning. The news had filled him with relief and exhaustion in equal measure. The war was ending. He would survive. He would return to Margaret and Sarah, resume his life as a teacher, try to forget the horrors he had witnessed and participated in. But orders had come down to continue offensive operations until the very moment the armistice began a decision that struck Anderson as criminally wasteful, throwing away lives for territory that would be abandoned anyway under the armistice terms. That morning, during a patrol of newly captured German positions, Anderson had discovered the wounded German soldier in a shell crater. The man had been calling out weakly in German, words Anderson didn't understand but whose meaning was universal. Pain, fear, the desire not to die alone. Anderson's training, his orders, and military doctrine all said to leave him an enemy wounded were the enemy's responsibility. Anderson had thought of Sarah, his daughter, back home. Imagined some German officer walking past her if she were dying and in need of help. He had climbed into the crater, knowing he was exposing himself to potential enemy fire, knowing his own men would think him foolish for risking his life with the war nearly over. Müller watched as the German soldiers' movements became weaker, the characteristic signs of approaching death. The man's hand, which had been gripping Anderson's sleeve, slowly relaxed and fell away. Anderson continued holding it, continuing his prayers or words of comfort. Through the scope, Müller saw the German soldier's chest rise and fall in increasingly shallow breaths, then stop entirely. The man was dead. Captain Anderson remained still for a long moment, then gently closed the dead soldier's eyes with his fingertips. He made the sign of the cross over the body, a gesture that surprised Müller. Was Anderson Catholic, or was this simply a universal act of respect for the dead? Anderson stood slowly, his body stiff from kneeling in the cold November morning. He retrieved his field jacket from beneath the dead man's head, carefully arranging the body into a more dignified position. Then he did something that made Müller's breath catch. Anderson saluted the dead German soldier. It was a crisp, formal military salute, the kind rendered to honor a fallen comrade. This American officer was honoring an enemy soldier with the same respect he would show his own dead. Müller lowered his rifle entirely, no longer even pretending to consider the shot. Something had fundamentally shifted inside him. He had spent 3 years learning to suppress his humanity, to transform himself into an efficient killing machine, to view enemy soldiers as targets rather than human beings. In less than 10 minutes, Captain Anderson had demolished that carefully constructed dehumanization simply by demonstrating basic human decency. Through his scope, Müller saw Anderson begin to move away from the shell crater, heading back toward American lines. This was the moment Anderson's back was to him an even easier shot than before. Müller raised his rifle again, settling the crosshairs between Anderson's shoulder blades. At this range, the bullet would penetrate the heart and lungs, death nearly instantaneous. It would be painless, as much as any death in war could be painless. Müller's finger found the trigger again. 2 kilograms of pressure. That was all that separated Anderson's continued existence from oblivion. But Müller thought about what killing Anderson would mean. It wouldn't change the outcome of the war. Armistice would proceed regardless. It wouldn't save German lives or advance any military objective. It would simply remove from the world a man who had shown, in a small but profound way, that humanity could persist even in humanity's darkest moments. It would make the world measurably worse, darker, colder. Müller had killed 47 men in this war, but he found he could not make Anderson the 48th. Instead, Müller did something he had never done before. He deliberately missed. He aimed 5 meters to Anderson's left and fired a single shot. The bullet kicked up dirt where it impacted, and Anderson dove for cover behind a fallen tree. Müller chambered another round and fired again, this time 5 meters to Anderson's right. The American officer scrambled toward his lines, moving in the erratic zigzag pattern trained soldiers used to avoid sniper fire. Müller fired a third shot, again deliberately missing, maintaining the illusion of a sniper engaging but failing to hit his target due to range or luck. Anderson disappeared into American positions, safe. Müller lowered his rifle and sat back against the farmhouse wall, his hands shaking. He had just violated his orders, his duty, and everything he had been trained to do. He had let an enemy officer escape when he had a perfect shot. By rights, he could be court-martialed for dereliction of duty if his superiors discovered what he had done. But Müller felt no regret. Instead, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years, a sense of moral clarity. Müller remained in his sniper position as the morning progressed, though he no longer sought targets. Through his scope, he observed the battlefield's strange transformation as word of the impending armistice spread through both lines. Fighting continued, artillery still thundered, machine guns still chattered. There was a surreal quality to it, a sense of everyone going through deadly motions while knowing it would all end in a few hours. According to historical records documented in the United States Army's official history of the American Expeditionary Forces, more than 2,800 men would die on this final day of the war, killed in the hours between the armistice's signing at 5 o'clock that morning and its implementation at 11 o'clock. Müller checked his watch, 9:45, less than an hour and 15 minutes, until the guns fell silent. Somewhere in the distance, he heard singing British or American voices, he couldn't tell which, carrying across no man's land. The song was familiar. one that had become popular among Allied troops. Pack up your troubles in your old kit bag. The incongruity of hearing enemy soldiers singing while artillery continued to pound positions struck Mueller as perfectly capturing the war's absurdity. From his elevated position in the farmhouse ruins, Mueller had a panoramic view of the battlefield. The Argonne Forest had been reduced to a wasteland of shattered trees, shell craters, and mud. This ground had cost thousands of American and German lives to contest, and soon it would simply be French territory again, returned under the armistice terms. All that death, all that suffering, for mud that would grow grass again, and trees that would eventually regenerate. The waste of it all crashed over Mueller like a wave. He thought about what he would do when the war ended. Return to Munich, if he survived the next hour. Try to resume his philosophy studies, though the questions that had fascinated him in 1914 seemed trivial now. How could he sit in university seminars discussing Kant and Hegel after what he had witnessed? How could he debate abstract ethics when he carried the weight of 47 kills? Would his father still be alive? His mother? His younger sister Anna? Communication from home had become sporadic as Germany's situation deteriorated. He might return to find his family dead, his home destroyed, his country starving under the Allied blockade. Mueller was pulled from these dark thoughts by movement in the American lines. Through his scope, he saw Captain Anderson again, now back with his unit. Anderson appeared to be organizing his men, gesturing toward positions they should hold. Even from this distance, Mueller could see the exhaustion in Anderson's posture. It's the way he moved like a man running on willpower alone. How long had Anderson been in combat? Months, certainly. Mueller felt a strange kinship with this enemy officer he had spared. They were both survivors, both men who had somehow maintained their humanity despite the war's best efforts to strip it away. At 10:15, a massive American artillery barrage began, one of the most intense Mueller had experienced. The ground shook continuously, and the air filled with the scream of incoming shells. Mueller pressed himself against the farmhouse wall, knowing his position could take a direct hit at any moment. This final hour intensification of fighting seemed particularly criminal men, dying for nothing when peace was 45 minutes away. Later historical analysis would reveal that some Allied commanders, particularly American General John Pershing, had ordered continued offensive operations to the final moment, believing it would strengthen the Allied negotiating position. At 10:30, Mueller noticed something unusual. Soldiers on both sides were beginning to emerge from their positions despite ongoing fire. Men stood on parapets, sat on trench edges, some even climbing out into no man's land as if testing whether the war was truly ending. A few Germans and Americans were shouting to each other across the lines, though Mueller couldn't make out the words. An eerie, anticipatory atmosphere was building, a collective holding of breath as the appointed hour approached. Mueller descended from his sniper position, carefully making his way through the ruined farmhouse. He had decided he no longer wished to be alone when the war ended. He wanted to be with his unit, with the men he had served alongside for years. His closest friend, Corporal Hans Weber, had survived the war a near miracle, given the attrition rate. Weber had been with him since 1914, one of the few original members of their regiment still alive. They had made a pact years ago that if they both survived, they would open a bookshop together in Munich, a dream that had sustained them through countless horrors. As Mueller walked toward German lines, carrying his rifle over his shoulder, he heard the artillery begin to slacken. Commands were being shouted, officers on both sides ordering their men to prepare for ceasefire. Mueller checked his watch again. 10:52. 8 minutes. He quickened his pace, wanting to reach friendly lines before the moment arrived. He didn't want to be shot by a nervous sentry in the war's final minutes. He found Weber and the remnants of their company huddled in a trench that had once been part of the German defensive line. There were 12 men left from a company that had numbered 240 when Mueller first joined it. 12 survivors from 4 years of war. The men's faces showed a mixture of disbelief, relief, and emotional exhaustion. Some were weeping openly. Others sat in stunned silence, unable to process that they had survived when so many hadn't. Friedrich Weber called out, embracing him. "You made it. I was worried when you didn't come back earlier. I was at the old sniper position," Mueller replied. "Hans, the war is ending." "We survived. I can't believe it," Weber said, his voice cracking. For years, Friedrich. For years of hell, and we survived. At 10:58, their lieutenant, a young officer named Dieter Schneider, who had only joined them in September, ordered everyone to check their watches and prepare for ceasefire. The men synchronized their timepieces 10:59. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell began to chime. Mueller counted the bells 1, 2, 3. The other men counted aloud with him 4, 5, 6. The artillery had stopped entirely now. 7, 8, 9. Even the machine guns had fallen silent. At 10, 11. 11 o'clock. November 11th, 1918. The 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. The Great War was over. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then slowly, men began to emerge from trenches and fortifications on both sides. A cheer went up from the Allied lines, a roar of triumph and relief. The German response was more subdued relief mixed with the bitter knowledge of defeat. Mueller stood frozen, unable to fully comprehend that he no longer needed to kill or fear being killed. The silence was deafening. After 4 years of constant artillery, machine gun fire, and explosions, the absence of combat noise felt wrong, almost threatening. Muller's ears rang in the sudden quiet, and he realized the damage from years of bombardment would likely leave him partially deaf for life. Around him, German soldiers reacted in various ways. Some laughed hysterically, the sound edged with madness. Others wept. Many simply sat down wherever they were, as if their bodies had been waiting for permission to finally stop, to cease the constant vigilance that survival required. Within 30 minutes of the ceasefire, something remarkable began to happen. Soldiers from both sides started approaching no man's land, tentatively at first, then with increasing confidence. Germans and Americans, enemies just minutes before, were meeting in the crater-pocked wasteland between the lines. Mueller watched as men exchanged cigarettes, shared rations, showed each other photographs of families back home. The transformation from deadly adversaries to fellow survivors happened with startling speed, as if everyone had been waiting for permission to acknowledge their shared humanity. Mueller found himself walking toward the shell crater where Captain Anderson had comforted the dying German soldier. The body was still there, already stiffening in death's rigor. Mueller knelt beside his fallen countryman, noting the man's youth. He couldn't have been more than 19. His identification tags read Private Martin Becker, age 18, Munich. Munich, Muller's hometown. This boy had lived in the same city as Mueller, walked the same streets, perhaps attended the same university. They might have passed each other on the Marienplatz, and never known they would end up here, on this battlefield, one dead and one alive by pure chance. You were the sniper. The voice spoke in English, heavily accented but clear. Mueller turned to find Captain Anderson standing a few meters away, his hands raised slightly to show he meant no threat. You had me in your sights this morning. I know because I felt it. Every soldier knows when they're being targeted. But you didn't shoot. Mueller stood slowly, unsure how to respond. His English was decent. He had studied it at university, but finding the words for this moment challenged him. No, he finally said. I did not shoot. I could not. What you did for this soldier, for Private Becker? Mueller gestured to the body. It was more brave than anything I have done in this war. Anderson approached and stood beside Mueller, both men looking down at Private Becker's body. I'm sorry for your loss, Anderson said quietly. He was very young. He asked for his mother at the end. I told him she was proud of him, that he was going home. I hope that brought him some comfort. Mueller felt tears again, the second time in one day, after years of being unable to cry. His family is in Munich. They should know how he died, that he was not alone. I'll write to them, Anderson said. If you give me the address, I'll make sure they know their son's final moments were peaceful, that someone was with him. The two men stood in silence for a moment. Former enemies united in their grief for a boy who should have been studying at university or learning a trade, not dying in French mud. Mueller thought about the chain of events that had led to this moment. The assassination in Sarajevo in 1914, the mobilization of armies, the failure of diplomacy, the years of slaughter. And now this two men who should have killed each other instead, showing mutual respect over a shared grave. I am Friedrich Mueller, he said, extending his hand. Munich, Germany, philosophy student before the war, sniper during it, Anderson shook his hand firmly. James Anderson. Portland, Maine in America. School teacher, infantry officer, survivor. We are both survivors, Mueller agreed. As the day progressed, the surreal transformation of the battlefield continued. By afternoon, no man's land had become a bizarre carnival of former enemies fraternizing. Soldiers traded souvenirs, helmets, insignia, cigarettes, chocolate, anything portable. Impromptu soccer games broke out in places. Some men sang together, discovering that music transcended language barriers. It was as if everyone needed to immediately prove to themselves that they were still capable of normal human interaction, that the war hadn't completely destroyed their ability to see the humanity in others. Mueller and Anderson spent several hours together. Joined by Hans Weber and several American soldiers from Anderson's company, they shared stories carefully edited to avoid the worst horrors, focusing instead on absurd moments, narrow escapes, and the small acts of kindness that had sustained them. Mueller learned that Anderson's daughter Sarah was now 6 years old, that his wife Margaret worked as a nurse, that he desperately wanted to return to teaching. Anderson learned about Muller's family, his hopes of opening a bookshop with Weber, his love of philosophy and literature. "There's something I need to tell you," Anderson said as the afternoon shadows grew longer. "I recognized you weren't trying to hit me this morning. Those shots were deliberately aimed to miss. You were warning me, giving me a chance to escape. Why, you could have killed me easily." Mueller considered how to explain. "For 3 years I have killed 4 Germany. 47 men. I remember each one, carry them with me always. But this morning, watching you with Private Becker, I understood something. The war had taught me to see enemies, but you showed me I was still capable of seeing humans. If I had killed you, I would have destroyed that in myself. The war would have won completely." Anderson nodded slowly. "The greatest victory in any war isn't on the battlefield. It's preserving our humanity despite everything that tries to strip it away. You achieved that victory this morning, Friedrich? You've saved both of us, me physically, but yourself spiritually." As evening approached, officers on both sides began ordering men back to their respective lines. The fraternization would continue for several days, but military discipline was reasserting itself. Mueller and Anderson exchanged addresses, promising to write after they returned home. They agreed to somehow ensure Private Becker's family received word of how their son died, and that an American officer had been with him in his final moments. "If you ever come to America," Anderson said, as they prepared to part, "you must visit Portland. You and Hans both. You'll stay with my family. I'll show you a country that isn't tearing itself apart. And if you come to Germany," Mueller replied, "when we have recovered from this catastrophe, you will visit Munich. Hans and I will have our bookshop, and you will be our honored guest." They shook hands one final time, both knowing that the promises might never be fulfilled. The world was changed. Germany faced revolution and hardship, and the future was uncertain. But the promises mattered anyway, symbols of hope that normalcy might someday return. As Mueller walked back toward German lines with Weber, he felt lighter despite the exhaustion. The war had ended, and he had survived with his humanity intact. The years that followed tested the promises made that November day. Germany descended into chaos, revolution, hyperinflation, political violence, and the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles signed on June 28, 1919. Mueller returned to Munich to find his father dead from the Spanish influenza that had swept the world, his mother struggling to survive on meager rations, and his sister Anna, married to a wounded veteran who couldn't find work. The country Mueller had fought for was broken, its people desperate and angry. Mueller and Weber did manage to open their bookshop in 1921, calling it Phoenix Books in hope of resurrection from ashes. It was a small shop in Schwabing, Munich's Bohemian district, specializing in philosophy and literature. Business was difficult few. Germans had money for books during the hyperinflation crisis, but they survived through careful management and Muller's refusal to abandon the dream that had sustained him through the war. He wrote to James Anderson regularly during these years, and Anderson replied faithfully. Through their correspondence, maintained across an ocean, in the vast gulf of their different circumstances, Mueller learned about Anderson's readjustment to civilian life. The American officer had returned to teaching, though he struggled with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress. Anderson wrote about nightmares, about difficulty connecting with people who hadn't experienced the war, about the challenge of teaching history to students who saw war as something glorious and abstract. In 1923, Anderson sent a letter that included a newspaper clipping from the Portland Press-Herald. It was an article Anderson had written about Private Martin Becker and the events of November 11, 1918. The article described how a German sniper had spared Anderson's life after witnessing an act of mercy. How this moment of humanity in the midst of mechanized slaughter had restored both men's faith in human goodness. The article ended with a plea for peace and understanding between nations, warning that the harsh treatment of Germany under the Versailles Treaty was sowing seeds for future conflict. Mueller kept that article in a frame in his bookshop, displayed alongside a photograph of Private Becker that the boy's mother had sent him. She had written to Mueller after Anderson contacted her, expressing gratitude that her son's final moments had been peaceful and that someone remembered him. The photograph showed a smiling boy in a school uniform, taken before the war transformed him into a soldier. Mueller looked at that photograph every day, a reminder of what he had preserved by not shooting Anderson and what the war had destroyed by taking Becker. In 1933, Germany underwent another transformation, one that filled Mueller with dread. The Nazi Party came to power, and with it a renewed militarism and nationalism that Mueller recognized as leading toward another catastrophe. He watched with growing horror as Germany rearmed, as old veterans like himself were celebrated not for surviving, but for supposedly not winning propaganda lie that blamed Germany's defeat on civilian betrayal rather than military reality. Mueller refused to join the Nazi Party, a decision that made life difficult for his bookshop but which he considered non-negotiable. He had seen what nationalism unrestrained by humanity could accomplish. The last letter Mueller received from James Anderson arrived in September 1939. Shortly after Germany invaded Poland and another world war began, Anderson wrote, "Friedrich, my friend, I fear we have failed. All of us who survived the First War were supposed to ensure there would never be another. Instead, the children who were infants during the First War are now being sent to fight a second. I think often of that November morning when we met over Private Becker's body, how we promised each other that what we had survived must mean something, must lead to something better. I still believe it did mean something, that the humanity we preserved that day matters, even if the world around us has forgotten. If this war comes to America, as I suspect it will, I'm too old to fight, but my students will go. I'll watch another generation march off as we did. Believing in glory they'll discover is only horror. I pray you stay safe, my friend. Remember that day in the Argonne? Remember that we proved, if only for a moment, that men can choose mercy over killing. That will always be true, regardless of what governments and armies demand." Mueller never had the chance to reply. The German Postal Service stopped delivering mail to America after Pearl Harbor in December 1941. Phoenix Books survived through the Second World War despite bombing raids that destroyed much of Munich. Mueller and Weber, both too old for military service, remained in their shop, a small island of humanistic values in a nation consumed by totalitarian madness. They secretly sheltered a Jewish family in their basement for 2 years, knowing discovery would mean death but unable to stand by while innocents were murdered. After the war ended in May 1945, Mueller tried to locate James Anderson. It took until 1947, but he finally received word through the Red Cross. Anderson had died in 1944 of a heart attack. He had been 55 years old. His wife Margaret sent Mueller a letter explaining that James had never fully recovered from the First War, that the nightmares had never stopped, and that the outbreak of the Second War had deeply depressed him. "He spoke of you often," Margaret wrote. "He said that meeting you was proof that there was still good in the world, even in humanity's darkest hours." That belief sustained him. Mueller lived until 1978, reaching the age of 84. Phoenix Books became a Munich institution, a gathering place for philosophers, students, and those who believed in humanity's better nature. Mueller gave frequent talks about the Great War, always centering his remarks on November 11, 1918, and the choice he made not to shoot Captain James Anderson. He would show the newspaper article, the photograph of Private Becker, and the letters from Anderson, using them to illustrate a simple but profound point, that even in war's absolute horror, individual humans retain the power to choose mercy over killing, humanity over hatred. The story of the German sniper who spared the American officer became something of a legend, passed down through generations. It was referenced in historical accounts of the armistice and occasionally appeared in textbooks about World War I. In 3 years before his death, Mueller was interviewed by a historian working on an oral history project about the Great War. The recording of that interview, now preserved in the Bavarian State Archives, captures Muller's voice, still strong despite his advanced age. Describing that November morning, Hans Weber, Muller's friend and business partner, survived until 1982. Before his death, he ensured that the letters between Mueller and Anderson, along with Private Becker's photograph and the newspaper article, were donated to the Munich City Museum, where they remain on display today. They serve as a small but powerful reminder that even in humanity's darkest hours, individuals can choose light over darkness, mercy over cruelty, life over death. The farmhouse where Friedrich Mueller had Captain James Anderson and his crosshairs no longer exists, destroyed by subsequent wars and time. But the shell crater where Anderson comforted Private Martin Becker has been preserved as part of the Musargon American Cemetery Memorial Site. A small plaque was installed there in 1995 on the 77th anniversary of the armistice, commemorating the event. It reads simply, "Here, on November 11, 1918, an American officer showed mercy to a dying German soldier, and a German sniper showed mercy to that American officer. In their choices, they demonstrated that humanity endures even in war's darkest moments." The story of that November morning continues to resonate because it offers something increasingly rare, evidence that individuals matter, that single acts of mercy can ripple through time, that the choice to preserve humanity rather than destroy it remains available, even in circumstances designed to eliminate such choices. Friedrich Mueller made that choice, and in doing so, he saved not just James Anderson's life, but his own soul. In the end, both men understood that the war's true victory wasn't measured in territory gained or enemies killed, but in moments like that November morning, when humanity triumphed over the machinery of death, when two men who should have been enemies recognized each other as brothers in suffering, united by their shared determination to preserve compassion in a world bent on destroying it. That morning in the Argonne forest, with one finger on a trigger and another man in his crosshairs, Friedrich Mueller proved that even in war's absolute horror, the choice to be human rather than merely a soldier never disappears. It only waits for someone brave enough to make it.